You are listening to prosecution's closing arguments of the Jeffrey Willis trial out of Michigan. For those of you joining us live on the Law and Crime Network and on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109, this is the case that is a circumstantial evidence case. The prosecution and investigators are building a case on against Jeffrey Willis, the defendant, for the murder and disappearance of Jessica Harenga, who went missing 5 years ago and no dead body is found. If you were listening to the closing statements, you can hear that the prosecution was carefully taking us through other murders and other crimes allegedly convicted or allegedly committed by Jeffrey Willis, the defendant. First, we were to walk through the 2014 murder of Rebecca Bletch, which Jeffrey Willis is already convicted and found guilty of. And then we were walked through the woman who was a teen at the time, who's now awaiting trial for being abducted and held at gunpoint by Jeffrey Willis, but she escaped. And her story is what has connected the investigators to bring these charges against Jeffrey Willis in this case, and that is why it's relevant. With me in studio is Law and Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. Julie, what do you make of all this? We're waiting for defense to make their case next. Prosecution just rested. This is a circumstantial case, no direct evidence. What stands out to you most?
Well, I mean, I think when we talk about, I think the issue now is what is the defense going to say on summation? We have the prosecutor laying out a pretty amazing case against Jeffrey Willis in regards to not just the other victims in the case, but all the evidence that leads them to Willis. But again,
I was going to say, he's clearly not a likable guy right now. The prosecution has set him up. Nobody who's going to be anything normal as a juror on that stand is going to think that this is a likable guy.
I think he's more than not a likable guy. I think he comes off as a serial killer.
As a creepy serial killer who has videos and computer files and very calculating. But again, no direct evidence.
Right, but again, remember, the idea of circumstantial evidence is sometimes that evidence can mean more to someone than direct evidence. So sometimes when a witness testifies, one has to make a determination as to whether they're credible. When it comes to circumstantial evidence, it's very different because the evidence is there and it's for the jury to make a determination as to the value of that evidence. But there's no credibility of any witnesses that's in question in regards to much of this evidence.
And what about the fact that her own mother can't accept that her daughter is dead?
Well, the fact that the mother can't accept that has nothing to do with this case. There's no evidence that came forward in terms of the mother's belief or lack of belief that her child is dead. I think it's not unusual for a mother in the most horrible of circumstances to not believe or have some level of hope that they will eventually find the child. But in terms of this case, I mean, the jury has been instructed not to look at anything outside of this case other than what is introduced as evidence. And so I don't think that plays a role in the jury's determination.
And another thing is, one of the lead investigators brought up, he was a responding officer to the scene, that when he got to the scene, that everything was still there of Jessica's. Her purse was there. There was about $400 in cash in her purse. All her ID cards were there. Her credit cards were there. Her jacket was there, which goes to show that this wasn't a robbery, but some mysterious abduction where a drop of blood and a piece of a gun was found outside the back of the gas station where she was working that night, and then a co-worker was able to place as an eyewitness during her testimony, because she testified that there was a van which matched Jeffrey Willis's van at the time. So I agree, there's enough circumstantial evidence to really build this case. It looks like we need to go back into the courtroom live right now. The defense is now addressing and doing their closing arguments. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network. I'm Carissa Kranz, and we are live in the Jeffrey Willis trial. Right now, we are in the middle of closing arguments by defense attorney Johnson. Let's jump right back into the courtroom live so we don't miss any of this critical narrative of why Jeffrey Willis is not guilty. And there you have it. That is defense closing arguments. Right now we're going into the rebuttal of the prosecution, into closing arguments. But right after this break, we have to take a quick break. Stay with us. Welcome back, and we are here live in the courtroom on the Law&Crime Network with the Jeffrey Willis trial out of Michigan. Today, the state has rested, the defense has rested, and we just heard closing statements live. We heard closing statements from the prosecution, closing statements from the defense, and the rebuttal just finished. Very, very interesting stuff to discuss and dissect. Here with me is Julie Rendelman, criminal defense attorney. Thank you for staying with me and
thanks for having me.
Dissecting this and diving in. So, at first, I listened to closing arguments and I thought, prosecution did a really good job. Defense is going to have a hard time with this one. And then defense, I think he did a pretty good job at casting reasonable doubt, because we are in the American system, which he brought home with his quote at the very end, putting that duty and burden on the jury. If you were defending this case, do you think you could have done a better job? You think he did a good job?
I think he did a fine job. I think he did a fine job with the evidence that he had. I think he could have spent a little more time on the issues that raise reasonable doubt. I think he could have hammered home much more the fact that there is absolutely no eyewitness testimony, and the only eyewitness testimony that exists is a woman that identifies someone that doesn't look like him. He did that. He touched upon it, but I think he should have focused on that. I think, unfortunately, he's fighting a lot of demons, which is so much evidence came in against the defendant in regards to inappropriate things he was looking at on videos and things like that. I don't think he handled it the best way. I don't know that there is a good way to handle it, because it's just such a mess and no defense attorney wants to even have to talk about it. At the end of the day, the jury should understand, if they believe that this witness identified or believe that someone else did it, and they can't indicate that the person that was at that scene was him, that in and of itself is reasonable doubt. And that's what the jury should be focusing on.
Yep. To me, it seemed like the defense attorney did a fine job, like you said, trying to draw different narratives than what the prosecution drew. First, he tried to make it seem like a drug deal that went bad. Right. The lights were on, the lights were off. You know, the cash was in the purse because she didn't want the guy that she was going to go shoot up heroin with to take the cash. But to me, that seems more suspicious. If it were a drug deal, she'd take the cash with her. But
oh, absolutely, I agree with you. I think that, but again, remember, he's stuck with the evidence that exists, and so there's only so much you can argue to a jury to get them to believe that a woman would leave behind a boyfriend, a child, a family, all because she wanted to use drugs, leave all of her possessions behind. And that's hard to buy, especially when the evidence linking him to her abduction and murder is so overwhelming.
Right. So it does all come back to arguments on whether or not the defense can piece together the closing arguments in a way that the jurors found reasonable to say that there is reasonable doubt all over this case. Let's take a look at some of the closing arguments of the defense and how he's trying to say not guilty. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, we are live in the Jeffrey Willis trial. That was defense closing arguments that you just heard. We are recapping right now. This is the Michigan trial where the 25-year-old woman went missing 5 years ago. We have no body, and we have a jury that is soon to deliberate. With me is Julie Rendelman, criminal defense attorney. So we just heard prosecution give their closing, defense give their closing, a quick rebuttal. What do you think? Final answer, guilty or not?
Yeah, I think that the case is pretty overwhelming. I think is it possible that there might be a juror that holds out because they are bothered by the lack of forensic evidence? It's possible, but I think that for the most part, I think that they're going to be on the prosecution side.
Okay, we're going to jump to a quick break, but when we get back, we're going to listen to the prosecution's rebuttal, and you can listen in and see for yourself how you would come down if you were one of the jurors. Stick with us. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm your host, Carissa Kranz, and we are watching very closely in the courtroom the Jeffrey Willis trial out of Michigan. With me in studio is our guest, Julie Rendelman, and defense attorney. We are dissecting the closing arguments right now of the defense. And what do you think? Does it really come down to a light switch on and off and a drug deal gone bad, or is there more to this story?
I mean, it could. I just don't think that a jury's going to buy that this was a drug deal gone bad, and I don't think that they're going to care whether the light was on or off. I don't think there's any evidence that indicates that this was a drug deal gone bad or that she made a choice to leave her family behind.
Yeah, it seems to me that the defense is holding on to maybe some inconsistent testimony earlier of when that light may have been on or off, which is based solely on eyewitness testimony. One key thing to remember in this case is there's no cameras, which is unusual for a gas station to have no cameras. So none of this is actually caught on camera, and we are solely relying on circumstantial evidence. A co-worker who saw the van outside around the time that Jessica Hrange went missing, and then the responding investigators, the lead investigators to the scene in order to draw conclusions. And the big question is whether or not the jury is going to find that the evidence is conclusory beyond any and all reasonable doubt to find Jeffrey Willis guilty of murder of Jessica Hrange and her abduction. This is his second murder trial. He was already convicted in the Rebecca Bletch case in 2014, and he is awaiting a trial for the kidnapping and abduction of a teen who he held at gunpoint. But she escaped, Madison Nygaard. And Madison Nygaard we heard from in this case, the Jessica Hrange case. She was one of the key witnesses to help link the common scheme and plan together to find Jeffrey Willis guilty of abduction and murder of Jessica Hrange. Now, let's jump back into some closing arguments from the defense and see how he can continue to, or how successful he is at poking holes and reasonable doubt to the prosecution's case. How long has that blood been there, and how do you know? There you have it. That's defense closing arguments in the Jeffrey Willis trial out of Michigan. This is the case where he is accused of abducting and murdering Jessica Hrange. This is his second trial, for those of you just joining us on the Law and Crime Network and on Sirius XM Radio. He was already convicted of murder of Rebecca Bletch in 2014. We are closely monitoring the courtroom right now. We have just heard the defense attorney give his closing arguments. We're waiting on the judge to see if he's going to dismiss the jurors today or if he's going to ask them to deliberate through the night. And with me right now on set is Julie Rendelman. Just real quick, Julie, do you think we'll have a verdict today, or do you think it's going to go into tomorrow?
I have a feeling the judge is going to put the case over. They've had a long day, but I think there's going to be a very quick verdict. Excuse me.
I agree with you. I think nice try for the defense on poking holes in the case, trying to bring up reasonable doubt. Yes, it's a very tough criminal burden, but there's overwhelming circumstantial evidence in this case. We do need to throw to a quick break, but please stick with us. We're going to come back live in the courtroom with the feed and stay live on the network and on Sirius Radio, and we'll find out if we're going to have a verdict soon. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, and a special welcome to our Sirius Radio XM listeners on Channel 109. We are closely watching and monitoring the courtroom. Right now, the judge is instructing the jurors and preparing them for deliberations. I'm going to sign off now. This is the Jeffrey Willis trial out of Michigan. We should have a verdict soon. You can continue to watch us live on network and online, or download our app for a verdict if one were to come in soon, or you can catch us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with your host, Jesse Weber. Have a good night.